My name is Jules Kortenhorst. I'm the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. And on my right-hand side, Jörg Haas, Program Director for International Diplomacy. And on the very far right, Bert Metz, former Kyoto negotiator for the Netherlands, member of the IPCC, and a fellow of the European Climate Foundation. We start with this diagram, which shows you various pathways of emissions that lead to different climate outcomes. The good news of the meetings this summer in L'Aquila in Italy was that G8 leaders committed themselves to achieving a 2-degree maximum increase in temperatures. Now, a 2-degree outcome, according to the IPCC, which this graph depicts, is more or less in line with a 450 ppm world. And as my oldest son keeps reminding me, that, and remember, that is only about a 50-50 chance, a coin toss on our future. So all of our analysis is based on a pathway of 450 ppm, which generates, according to the IPCC, a 50-50 chance on a 2-degree expected temperature increase. Now, in order to move to that 450 pathway, we need to bend the curve of actual emissions. On this graph, the top line is the reference pathway, also known as business as usual. To my business friends, I remind them that business as usual actually doesn't mean there will be any usual business anymore. A top pathway leads to concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere of well over 600, 700 ppm and is therefore clearly unsustainable. And in order to move to the 450 ppm pathway of the previous graph, we need to bend this curve to the lower one of the two. And that means that by 2020, we need to have reduced global emissions by 17 gigatons from business as usual. And that reduction needs to be 35 gigatons by 2030. Remember that number of 17 gigatons. We'll come back to that. Many of you will have seen this graph before. It is the core of our analytical approach. It depicts McKinsey's global carbon cost abatement curve, in this case up to 2020. Along the horizontal axis, you see the amount of tons of mitigation that we believe is achievable for up to a maximum of 60 euros per ton incremental cost. And each of the bars represents a different lever of abatement. Each bar represents a different opportunity to mitigate climate emissions. On the y-axis, you see the incremental cost of that abatement. And as is obvious, on the left-hand side, the negative costs really represent, therefore, an opportunity for savings. A negative cost, in fact, a positive financial outcome, largely relates to those mitigation opportunities that are driven by energy efficiency. And you see many of them. Waste recycling, car emissions, light bulbs, etc. On the very right-hand side of the curve, you see those abatement opportunities that are still relatively costly by 2020. They relate to the more breakthrough technologies for energy supply, such as solar photovoltaic. And in the middle of the curve are many of the abatement opportunities that relate to agriculture and forestry, where the incremental cost is moderate and the opportunity for abatement by 2020 is very significant. Now, the good news of this curve is that the total number of abatement levers by 2020 adds up to 19 gigatons. So if you add all the opportunities to reduce emissions by 2020 up, you get to 19 gigatons of opportunities for emission reductions. And from the previous graph, we remember we needed 17 gigatons of emission reductions by 2020. Challenge, however, is that if you look at where these abatement opportunities regionally are located, the harsh reality is that 5 of the 19 gigatons are located in the developed world, and 14 gigatons of the abatement opportunities at a cost of 60 euros a ton or less reside in the developing countries. There are two important reasons for this. The first reason is that many of these abatement opportunities relate to land use, agriculture, deforestation. areas of opportunity for reduction in emissions that largely are located in the developing countries. The second reason is that between now and 2020, much of the new infrastructure, much of the new industrial capacity, much of the new capital expenditure will actually take place in the developing world. In fact, I recently learned a new statistic which says that in China, every 2 weeks, the total housing construction adds up to the size of a city the size of Boston in the United States. So the amount of construction and infrastructure built and capital expenditure that takes place in the developing world is so large that the opportunities to build that in a low carbon fashion are very significant. But in light of historical emissions and responsibilities, this is not a very helpful outcome, of course. So this is another way of looking at that challenge. On the left-hand side, 17 gigatons of required abatement to get us to a 450 ppm pathway. And of that 17 gigaton, 5 gigatons is the abatement that is technically feasible in developed countries at a cost of 60 euros a ton of CO2 equivalent or less. That leaves therefore 12 gigatons of abatement to be realized in the developing world. And from the previous graph we saw that there were a number of opportunities of abatement that actually have a negative cost, that are profitable. And those in the developing countries add up to about 3 gigatons on the very right-hand side of this chart. That is the abatement in developing countries with a negative cost, and which therefore could conceivably be done by developing countries in their own economic self-interest. That leaves with 9 gigatons of abatement that we need to achieve in order to hit a 450 ppm pathway in the developing world, but for which the incremental cost needs to be financed from the developed world. There are two mechanisms for that financing, and this graph shows how to think about that. The financing of incremental cost in the developing world by the developed countries can be done either through the carbon markets or through public financing. But the amount of financing that is available from the carbon markets depends critically on the tightness of the cap that is set in the developed world. If developed countries adopt a very tight ceiling on their emissions, it forces business to buy a lot of offsets, it creates a lot of financing flow through the carbon markets, and therefore the amount of financing that is needed for the developing world from the public purse is more limited. I therefore often joke to friends from ministries of finance in the developed world that they should be great proponents of tight caps in their countries because it reduces the burden on the treasury. And in this graph we have shown how a 25% aggregate cap in the developed world would lead to carbon market financing for approximately 3 gigatons of the 9 gigatons that needs to be financed by the developed world. And therefore a further 6 gigatons of abatement would need to be financed through the public purse. Now this gives you the framework of our analysis, and it provides the backdrop against which we would like to look at the current state of the negotiations. And at this point I'd like to hand over to Jörg Haas, who will talk to you about the state of current proposals and how they look towards closing this gap. Jörg?